Good afternoon. My name is Peggy Yee, and I'm the Managing Director of Global Food and Agriculture at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. A special thanks to our members for joining us for this conversation with another longtime supporter of the Council, Secretary Dan Glickman. I'm excited that Secretary Glickman is here today to tell us more about his new excellent book, Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, on the Farm, and at the Movies. Copies of the book are available for sale from our local independent partner, The Bookseller, and a link to that will be placed in the Zoom chat box. Before we get started, by means of a disclaimer, please note that the Council is an independent and nonpartisan organization and takes no institutional policy positions. Views expressed by participants on the program are their own. This conversation is live and the playback will be posted on the Council's website shortly after we conclude. For the audience Q&A portion, you can submit your questions through the chat function of Zoom, or if you want to talk directly with Dan, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. With that said, I'd like to have a warm welcome to Secretary Dan Glickman. As most of you know Dan's background, but I wanted to review his illustrious career. Dan served 18 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing the 4th Congressional District of Kansas. Then from 1995 to 2001, Dan served as the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture under President Clinton. After spending some time at Harvard University, Dan became chairman of the Motion Picture Association of America from 2004 to 2010. He is a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center and recently retired as vice president and executive director of the Aspen Institute Congressional Program. Last but certainly not least, Dan is a distinguished fellow at the Chicago Council's Center on Global Food and Agriculture, where he has been instrumental for more than a decade in advancing critical work in the areas of global food and nutrition security. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us, Dan.
Thank you, Peggy. Glad to be with you.
Fantastic. What we'll be able to do is I'll ask a few questions to get the conversation started. Then I will turn it over to the audience to chime in to join the conversation. As a reminder, if you have a question that you would like to ask and you would prefer that I read the question out loud, feel free to use a chat function to ask the question, and I'll do my best to monitor the chat box. Otherwise, feel free to raise your hand by going to the bottom of your Zoom screen, clicking on reactions and clicking on the raise hand button, and I'll call on you. So, Dan, let's get started with the premise of the book. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, you know, Peggy, first of all, thanks to the Chicago Council and to you, my friend Ivo Dalder, and everybody at the council for the great work that you're doing. Glad to be involved with it. So, you know, I've been in politics for a long time and started out as just I was president of the 5th grade at Fabrique Elementary School, election commissioner at Southeast High School. But basically, I decided after all my years in politics that something's happened in American politics and we've become humorless, that nobody seems to take themselves very seriously. And whatever humor there is in politics today is stilted, is often bullying humor. It's not natural, not authentic. And I've studied enough history to know that a lot of our great leaders in the history of our country, whether it's Lincoln or impactful leaders, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Reagan, Kennedy, and others, were able to influence people and change the world because they had a great self-deprecating sense of humor. And that seems to be missing. And so I decided I'd look at my career. I had parents who helped me genetically develop this sense of humor, I guess you'd say, and look how it made a difference in my life and also how it makes a difference in making our world and our country a better place. And so I decided I'm going to write a book about this.
I know that you, in terms of the key point for me in reading your book, and I'd love to be able to read this for the benefit of our audience here, possessing a strong sense of humor is such an important part of who I am and how I have always thought about my career. Making people laugh, make people comfortable, and I try to build consensus around basic points of our agreement. A sense of humor and a little humility can go a long way towards accomplishing agreement in every aspect of life, including politics, as you so aptly said right now as well. In that arena, if people like you are closer to gathering support and finding success. It all starts with being liked. And so you also mentioned a little bit more in your book about the importance of your family upbringing. So as the son of Jewish immigrants, your father enabled you to build, and his humor enabled him to build relationships and be successful in the Wichita community. Tell us more a little bit about your father and your upbringing, and tell us about how all those lessons about humor have made you who you are.
Well, both my parents were actually very funny. My mother had this natural wit. My dad was the Henny Youngman, Rodney Dangerfield, take my wife, please type of humor. And he was kind of on a constant shtick of argument and humor, and not argument, but more humor. But what he found, and I watched him, is that he could diffuse tough situations by making people feel comfortable. And often that was through self-deprecating humor. So he used to tell me that during the Depression, where he was a kid and they ran out of money, and he had to quit college, and my grandparents made him come back from University of Oklahoma back to Kansas to work in my grandparents' business, that even doing business during the Depression, if you were funny and people liked you and you were optimistic, that you could actually weather a lot of storms in life. And so when people used to say, how's business, even when business was terrible, he would say, it's terrific, because he found that people would not want to do business with unsuccessful people. And so I guess it just kind of naturally came. My grandparents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, like a lot of Jewish immigrants who came. They ended up in Kansas. I'm not exactly sure. I asked my grandfather, how did you get to Kansas? And he said he took the train. So, it's like but we ended up in Wichita, and my family went into the scrap iron business and then the oil business. And then we owned a AAA baseball team affiliated with Chicago Cubs for 10 years. Back then, it wasn't a very successful baseball operation because the Cubs weren't very good during that time period.
If only your dad were able to see what happened with the Cubs.
That's right. That's right. We got out too late.
I see. Yeah. So you mentioned the importance of self-deprecating humor, and I know that you have worked so successfully across party lines. And you mentioned in your book that early on in your political career, you reached out to Senator Bob Dole, who provided you with some valuable advice about staying in Kansas to get to know what issues people really care about. He sort of became a mentor, then a colleague, then ultimately a friend. And you work with so many other people across the aisle, including with recently retired Senator Pat Roberts. This seems almost unthinkable today with partisan politics. So what made it possible for you to reach across political parties to get things done?
Well, first of all, I was a Democrat from Kansas, so that's an oxymoron. Kansas is the longest running state in the country that has not elected a Democratic senator. So you know that I was not necessarily in the ideological or political majority, but I had to cross party lines to get things done, whether it was in agriculture, which is a big part of my life, or in aviation or entertainment, or all the things that I did. And so even though, for example, Senator Dole and I were on opposite sides of the political aisle, we worked together on things involving Kansas. And, I tried not to burn bridges. I tried to build bridges, which is something that's very hard for politicians in today's climate to do. And we can talk about why that's the case. But it also turned out that Senator Dole had a great sense of humor, and so did Senator Pat Roberts. And so Kansas at one time was known as the funniest political state in the country. And I'm not sure that's necessarily true anymore. And so Dole became my chief advocate when I was nominated to be Secretary of Agriculture. Who would have thought that a Republican senator who was the majority leader of the United States Senate could be working for a Democrat to become Secretary of Agriculture? And in large part, he was the responsible person for President Clinton appointing me to the job.
Do you think we can ever get back to that sort of civility? And do you think that we can go back to being known as, with parts of the country being known as funny?
Well, I don't mean to be overly nostalgic, Peggy, either. We've had rough and tumble politics for a long time in this country. After all, even during the 1950s, there were people who shot up the House of Representatives. We've had fist battles on the floor of Congress before. But and by the way, there are lots of good things happening in Congress too. There are lots of members of Congress who do work collaboratively across the aisle. We've seen a little bit in this latest issue involving infrastructure, where we've seen people working together. I think there are things that work against that. Social media, nice, sweet behavior doesn't play well on social media. Tough stuff plays very well. The amount of money in politics today doesn't encourage people to collaborate and get along. And plus this constant race for money, it just takes up so much time of people in politics. But the other thing is that what I found is that, you know, I was in politics for a long time in Congress and I lost. And for about 3 days, I was pretty depressed. And then I found, you know what, life goes on, even if you lose. And I think a lot of members of Congress, a lot of people in politics think that these political jobs are the be all and end all, and they need them for the rest of their life. And they're going to be in really deep trouble if they don't keep them. And the truth is that there's plenty of good things to do in life besides politics as well. And once you lose, you recognize that.
That's wise words, very aptly said. I know that Glenn Fukushima, you have your hand up. Feel free to unmute yourself to ask a question.
And I know Glenn very well, too.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's great to see you. And we welcomed you to Japan as Secretary of Agriculture. And I've had a great admiration for you and your career. I have a specific question, which is this. I've long admired leaders such as you and others who have this gift of humor. Whether it's in politics or business or in any field, especially in the United States, I found that humor can be so effective. But you mentioned that you felt that you had some genetic advantage in this. And I'm wondering, what advice or tips would you give those of us who didn't have that genetic advantage? And in particular, I'm a Japanese American and my mother's from Japan. My father is a Japanese American from California. I grew up about half my life in Japan. And although I really appreciate humor, I found that in Japanese culture, it really isn't very appropriate, especially in business and politics, where in public, because it's considered to be trivializing or debasing the seriousness or the importance of the discussion. And so it has to be used very, very carefully. So for those of us who don't have that kind of genetic background that you have at advantage, what advice or tips would you give for us to be able to develop that sense of humor, which is so important in the United States?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Glenn, because first of all, I'm not advocating that people to go to comedy school and become comedians, because sometimes politicians are the worst comedians and it's not telling jokes. And when I talk about genetic, I think it's just in my DNA. And, you know, there certainly, if you look at the history of comedy in America, a lot of comedy came from Jewish immigrants who settled in the Lower East Side of New York. And my dad used to say that the times were so tough, they had nothing to look forward to. So they started making fun of themselves, and who knows what the reasons were. But I'd say the following. You're right. It's got to be culturally appropriate. And that's why I talk about self-deprecating sense of humor, where you can make fun of yourself, but not somebody else. Where you try to be respectful and use your humor in a way to build up somebody else and never tear that person down. And without being overly partisan about it, I think that our previous president, President Trump, to the extent that he used humor, mostly was bullying humor. It was tearing people down who had, whether they were handicapped or whether they were people of different backgrounds. That's not the kind of humor I'm talking about. I'm talking about the kind of natural, warm, authentic, genuine humor that kind of helps you build a case to influence people and also to make people like you. Because the other thing I found is if people like you, even if they have different points of view than you do, you will tend to build allies over the long term.
Thanks very much.
Great question, Glenn. And as a reminder, feel free to type in a question if you have a question in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand using the raise hand button at the very bottom of the Zoom screen. So maybe what we can do is, I have a couple more questions for Dan,
Sure.
and maybe we can shift a little bit more to your time in Hollywood. So moving from the storied halls of the US Capitol and the US Department of Agriculture onto the red carpet. Tell us more about what it was like working with Hollywood, and how is it similar to your time in politics?
Well, I used to say that when people ask me, well, how did I make it to Hollywood? And I said, well, when I was in agriculture, I grew popcorn. And then when I was in the movies, I sold popcorn. And so there was a natural tie there. And well, it gets a few chuckles. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of the same principles are at play in terms of getting along with people. But I wasn't a star. As you look at me, I'm not particularly glamorous. And I was involved in the business and lobbying side of the picture. It turned out that when I left Congress, I had a very good friend. His name was Jack Valenti. And Jack had been the chairman of the Motion Picture Association of America for over 35 years. He worked for President Lyndon Johnson and then went into that role. He was on the plane when Johnson was sworn in after the Kennedy assassination. So I worked with Valenti when I was in the Congress as a member of the House Judiciary Committee, and we worked on issues like intellectual property protection and censorship issues. So even though I was mostly involved in agriculture in Congress, these were issues that there were interests both on the entertainment side and on the agriculture side, believe it or not. And so when I got the job in the motion picture business, I was mostly involved in lobbying the Congress and foreign governments on issues involving stopping in film piracy and intellectual property and stopping censorship and increasing foreign trade. And a lot of these issues were also issues I had worked on in terms of increasing agricultural trade and working globally. And I've always been very much involved in America's global role in the world, which of course the council works on all the time with all your polling and everything else, you know. So both the movie industry, where over 50% of our product in film and television has to be exported, and the agriculture industry, where over 50% of our product has to be exported overseas, have a lot of parallels there. So that's what tied together. I tell them that that Angelina Jolie or Scarlett Johansson was not calling me every night and asking me my opinions. I was mostly working with the studio executives.
Well, that's interesting. I never really thought about the parallels there with 50% of our movies and entertainment being exported along, you know, with 50% of our agricultural products being exported as well. So there's certainly some parallels, as you mentioned, the importance of intellectual property rights and the like, and being able to have issues that cross various disciplines. So
well, one thing I might mention, what's interesting is that, you know, being Secretary of Agriculture was a great honor, and I loved the job. And it had a lot, you know, I was not only involved in farm programs, but food stamps, school meals, hunger, poverty, domestic and globally, and a lot of things. But as much access as I had as being Secretary of Agriculture, being in the cabinet, I had 10 times more access working at the Motion Picture Association. I mean, people love Hollywood worldwide, globally. They didn't much care that I wasn't a star, or I just was associated with Hollywood. And so, and it's one of the great, basically strong soft powers of the United States of America. It's our ability to produce film and television and other content that makes people happy worldwide. So that part of the job was certainly very much fun.
now that's an interesting concept. How do we couple agriculture with movies and making it more appealing and more attractive to get more attention and essentially people to be able to do work in different areas?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about your time as the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. In your book, you've mentioned how passionate people are about their food and what they eat, and they have very strong opinions, and they make them known. And I think you mentioned that you had a security detail that would be only rivaled by the Secret Service, and you had your share of contentious run-ins with the public. And I've seen also my fair share of some bison gut piles, but probably nothing to the effect that you did in trying to address brucellosis. So this is clearly an area that many people are passionate about, and as you are as well. And we at the Chicago Council are so grateful for your continued interest and involvement in food and agriculture. So tell me more about why this is an area that you continue to work in and why it's still important to you.
Well, one is, first of all, people care very much about food. So as you mentioned, I was assaulted 4 times when I was Secretary of Agriculture, infected buffalo guts, genetically modified seeds. I was a tofu cream pie thrown at me, broken giant water bottles, glass bottles thrown at me. A lot of these things happened, which fortunately I survived all of them, but it did teach me in these various incidences that people do care about their food. It's extraordinary. And by the way, after I left, they substantially increased the security detail for the Secretary of Agriculture, because I do believe that its history will be written. I was the most assaulted member in the cabinet, in the history of the cabinet, except those that might have been an attempted assassination. But in any event, I managed through that thing. But what I have found is that of all the things we deal with in life, food is such a critical part of not only our culture, but our economy and just our way of life. So domestically, in terms of support for farmers and ranchers, support for hungry people at home who need our feeding programs, safe food safety, nutrition, which we're working on right now with the Chicago Council to try to find ways to link food, nutrition, health, medicine, and agriculture a lot more than we do. And then our global role in all of this stuff, because we're the largest donor to the UN food agencies in terms of our surplus commodities. We're very much involved in trying to help feed the world and build sustainable feeding systems around the world. So these are really important issues, and sometimes they don't get raised to the high enough profile as they should. And that's why I like working with the Chicago Council and some of the other groups that I've been working on to raise the profile and to realize that food policy is a critical part of global policy, of national policy. And if I just may add, our work in the Feed the Future initiative and the US government's work in Feed the Future was started at the Chicago Council with Catherine Bertini and others that we worked together on about 10 years ago.
And that effort has been so crucial and so fundamental to how we address food aid and being able to address global food security as well. So we certainly thank you for those efforts, and it wouldn't have been possible without you and Catherine Bertini in leading that work. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And it's made a big difference, because I think you're seeing now with climate change how food policy, food security, hunger, prevention of crop disease, animal disease are all impacted by this changing weather and global climate patterns that we're facing. And it's the most vulnerable that will suffer, not only the poor, but also the developing world. And so, the US has a big role to play, both the private sector and the public sector, in being engaged in these issues. And I think we went through a period of kind of America trying to disengage from the rest of the world, what I call the America First policy, but you can't disengage. It's just impossible for a country with our values and our size to do that. I think it was Will Rogers years ago who said, America has two of the greatest friends in the world. They're the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Well, we have seen that those oceans don't stop a massive pandemic from infecting us. In fact, we have suffered more loss of life than any other country in the world, I think, to date because of that. But it's also true with respect to food and agriculture policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I know that that Glenn had asked a question about how do we use humor that's culturally appropriate. How can we use, so I know that maybe this is a question that others might have, but how do we insert humor into conversations? Do you have any tricks in being able to see how we might be able to insert either self-deprecating humor, or what are your tricks of the trade for those who are not genetically inclined to that?
Okay, well, first of all, don't try to tell bad jokes, because they either will be culturally inappropriate or just flat and bad. So the best humor is natural humor. And so I'll give you kind of a couple of examples, because I've had my ups and downs in life, but I found that singing sometimes can be a great way to break down barriers. So a couple of times I've come out and burst out in song in large groups with making fun of myself. I'm not saying everybody can do that everywhere, but it was certainly a good way to break the ice. And I appreciate Glenn's question, but I have also found that humor is a global, worldwide phenomenon. Everybody likes to smile. Everybody wants to be happy. And maybe the culture of the US is a little different, but wherever I've traveled, I have found that people appreciate good, appropriate, sensible humor, and it does tend to break down barriers. And it's not just humor per se. One interesting story, back in the old days when I was in the government, I was in China representing the United States. And so the chairman of the Communist Party then was a fellow named Jiang Zemin, who was maybe 5 leaders before the current chairman. And his staff person came up to me, and I may have been at the Motion Picture Association at the time. But anyway, they said the chairman loves John Wayne movies. He loves them. He learned most of his English, he said, from John Wayne movies. And so he says, as a great personal favor, could I get the chairman, it was before DVDs, they were VHS John Wayne movies. So I proceeded to call my friends at the various studios, and I said, the chairman of the Communist Party wants every John Wayne movie we could find. So we found, he'd been in many, but we found 30 or 40, and we sent him the movie and the movies. And I got the note back from the ambassador in the United States saying, of all the president's mementos that the chairman had ever gotten, this was the absolute best president he'd ever gotten. And it taught me, hey, you better respond fast. And the second thing it taught me is how the power of film, and the fact that he had learned his English from John Wayne. I'm not saying John Wayne was the greatest academic theorist in the world, but he at least learned a little bit of English from that, and maybe learned a little bit about American values too.
Yeah, that sounds like certainly a case of successful diplomacy. Absolutely.
Anyway, tried our best.
I'd like to be able to turn this over to the audience to see if you have any questions. So feel free to raise your hand using the chat, the reaction button at the very bottom of the Zoom screen, and click on raise hand. Glenn has another question. Feel free to unmute yourself, Glenn.
Thank you. Since there aren't others asking questions, let me ask another question. I used to work at USTR and also was president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan. So I have a great deal of interest and appreciation for for international trade, including agriculture, because at one point, Clayton Yiter was my boss, who was USTR and then became Secretary of Agriculture a few years before you did. With the WTO now functioning at maximum capacity, with the US withdrawing from TPP and TTIP, things aren't looking too bright on the international trade side. And I think the Biden administration, for understandable reasons, is focusing domestically, and with the notion of a foreign policy for the middle class, there seems to be some sense of, not actively wanting to engage in international trade agreements. But what is your kind of prognosis and kind of recommendation as to how the U.S. can more effectively engage in the international and the global trade arena, so that we can both, protect and develop the benefits for the middle class and American citizens, but also, be able to trade and export and benefit others as well? Thanks.
Well, it's a very good question. And, clearly we have been more on the bilateral trade scenario in recent years rather than the multilateral trade scenario. So the WTO has not really been an extremely effective way of resolving disputes. And so the U.S. has gone, country by country rather than a larger picture. And, certainly we saw President Trump moving towards a much more restricted trade policy, but quite frankly, it's bipartisan, because there are also a lot of Democrats who believe that the U.S. has been taken advantage of in trade agreements, that we haven't, whether it's worker rights or intellectual property rights or dispute resolution techniques. But I know that they have appointed a new U.S. trade representative. I think her name is Catherine Tai. She has got a Hill background. I'm confident that she has got the expertise to try to make sure that we get back in the game in terms of engagement, so we don't pull out of all of these agreements that we've been trying to negotiate, whether it's on the Trans-Pacific side or on the European side. Again, as I pointed out before, and as our economy depends so much on our ability to export our products. It's not only entertainment, it's not only agriculture, it's aviation, it's high tech, and there's also a fixation with China right now, and China doesn't play the game always by the rules that we would like them to. but we have to work together the best that we can, fighting unfair trade practices, but working together on issues like public health, or space research, or science generally. And what's happened is that we just don't want to close ourselves off from the rest of the world, not only for foreign trade purposes, but also on these other issues. I mean, the COVID epidemic has demonstrated that, one outbreak can kill millions of people, and we're all inextricably linked together on these things. So, I think that the Biden administration is basically going down this path the right way, trying not to make enemies, but at the same time, being strong and enforcing American interests, where others are doing things inconsistent with us. So it's a complicated question you ask. That's just my best points that I can make.
Great. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for that question, Glenn. Scott Yonover, you have the next question.
Yeah, this is the easiest question you'll have all day. If I wanted to get my book personalized autographed, where do I send it?
Well, I would say that one, you get it to Peggy Yee at the Chicago Council,
Perfect.
and she'll make sure that I get it. If you send it to my house, I can't promise where it will end up, but that's the best way. I'd be glad to do that.
Thank you.
That was an easy question, by the way. Thank you for that.
Do we have any other questions, easy or difficult? Rudy.
Yes, Mr. Secretary, did you have, you might have said this earlier, did you have a favorite job? I mean, what a resume that you have.
It's funny. I'd say probably every job was different. So I'd say probably being a congressman was my favorite job, because I didn't have my boss was my constituents. My boss was not my party leader. Today, the party leaders are kind of the bosses of the members of Congress. So, that was just not true. You could be independent, more independent. Of course, I was a Democrat at a time when we had big margins in Congress. So it's easy to be more independent when you have an 80 or 100 vote margin than when it's 50-50 like it is today. So, and as Secretary of Agriculture, I was less independent because I worked for the President of the United States. I had a real boss, but I had more power because I had 100,000 people working for me, and I had power to make changes in farm programs and feeding programs and food safety and school meals. And so I had a lot of the power that Congress had given me over the years. And then when I was at the Motion Picture Association, I probably didn't have either the power or freedom, but I had access to one of the most interesting industries in the world, the American entertainment industry. So it was fun. And I can't tell you that it wasn't fun walking the red carpet. The only thing I can tell you is when I walked the red carpet, the paparazzi were out there, and a lot of people would saying, "Who is that man walking down there?" They didn't quite recognize me like they might have George Clooney or somebody like that. And I did think myself, I'm grandson of a Russian immigrant. Wouldn't my grandfather be proud of his grandson walking the red carpet? So I got a lot of a spinoff of the glamour in the thing, but I didn't have a lot of power, or I didn't have a lot of freedom, but I had a lot of access. So that, I could see almost any leader in the world representing the American motion picture industry. I recall seeing heads of state that I couldn't see when I was in the government, but I could see being in the movie industry. And that was certainly a lot of fun. So that's a long answer to your question, but I'd say probably the most fun personally was being a member of Congress.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to read the book. Thank you.
Thank you.
And as a reminder, you can purchase the book through the link that we have in the Zoom chat functions from the bookseller, CELLAR. Clever pun there. Our next question comes again from Glenn Fukushima. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry to ask so many questions, but Dan's got such a great wealth of experience and so many interesting topics. I want to ask my third question, which is this. I remember in the 1990s, we welcomed you with the American Chamber in Japan as Secretary of Agriculture. And in the 2000s, when Howard Baker was the US ambassador to Japan, I remember a chamber lunch in which you spoke, in which at the head table where you and Ambassador Baker and also Nancy Kassenbaum were discussing the fact that 20 years before that there was such bipartisan Democratic Republican cooperation on a whole range of issues, whereas now things are so polarized and so difficult, and people don't get together and have dinner and get to know each other personally as they used to. It seems that just within the last few months with President Biden, who's had such a long experience in the Senate, that he's really trying hard to go back to the bipartisanism, and the whole infrastructure discussion now seems to point positively in that direction. But what do you think is going to take to get back to a point where both on the Senate and the House side that we're going to be able to get the bipartisan cooperation and kind of get away from the January 6th type of thing that we've seen? I mean, how much time it'll take and what needs to be done in order to overcome that? Easy question. Thanks.
Yeah, such an easy question to answer, Glenn. But first of all, I do think that President Biden has this long Senate experience. So he reminds me to some degree like Lyndon Johnson. He knows the people in the Congress. He understands them. He feels their pain. He knows what they're going through. He understands constituent relationships. So I think that he will be really helpful in trying to move this agenda along, where he will try to diffuse partisanship when he can. But on the other hand, he's got a lot of partisans in his own party who are, find people on the left and people more on the left than on the right, but he's got to, on both sides. So it's a tough act to follow. But having a president who wants to govern, who wants to get things done, and understands what the Congress is all about, I think is an asset that we have today that we didn't have certainly the previous 4 years. And our great presidents have all been people who've known how to work with the Congress on a bipartisan basis. It doesn't mean that they haven't had problems and difficulties. Every president has had difficulties in dealing with those issues. But you have other issues now that make it much more difficult. The toxic nature of our media, particularly social media, where people watch what they want and they get the information that might be one-sided, the amount of money in politics, the decline of what I call local media, local newspapers. Local newspapers were a great democratic source of information, and they just hardly exist anymore. I mean, you have big papers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today, maybe, Washington Post, but you go, even my hometown of Wichita, we had a newspaper there, the Wichita Eagle. It had at one point, it had the highest penetration rate of any newspaper in the country, which meant more people in Wichita read the local paper than any other community in America on a per capita basis. And, today it's been sold and bought and sold and bought, and it almost looks like an advertising sheet within a major newspaper. And that's happened, all over the country. And then, the issue of civic education is another thing. It's not all the fault of our politicians. Some of it is that people don't know very much about their government, they fall prey to a lot of these politicians. Again, I won't mention any names, but I've mentioned his name before, who sometimes give people inaccurate information about life in general. So very complicated problem. I'm just hopeful that Joe Biden will be able to, build on his knowledge of our government and help to diffuse some of these conflicts.
Thanks. I think you've got a lot of wisdom, and I hope you'll write a book about this. Thanks.
Okay. One book is tough, but we'll try, maybe.
Maybe the next book can be on humor in civics and civility. There we go. So I think Dan has our last question here. And I think there was one other question in the chat box, which I think I'll read before I turn this over to Dan, who then you can unmute yourself, Dan. So Rika Sloan says one aspect of the agricultural sector is livestock, which requires so much land, water, and grain. As climate change increases and we lose more land and forest to development, what do you see as the best way to reduce livestock in the US diet? So that will be our second to last question. And then I'll call on Dan as our very last question.
Okay, well, first of all, it's an interesting question because livestock is actually the largest part of American and global agriculture in terms of dollars, GNP. We look at the row crops and more traditional plant agriculture, but agriculture is such a big part of, livestock is such a big part of, hogs, cattle, poultry, you name it, plus a variety of other things. And there's no question that the livestock in all of agriculture are very much involved in contributing to emissions and impact our climate. But one of the positive things I'm saying is that farmers around the country are really beginning to understand their role, their necessary role in being a contributing positive force to climate change. And especially younger and newer farmers, you're seeing that not only here at home and around the world. And the second thing has to do with science. We have to realize that research and development and science can be a great asset in producing an agriculture which is much more beneficial to the environment. And it means whether it's producing animals that consume less water or expel less methane into the atmosphere, or using eating plants which are a more positive force in the environment, and also diversification in agriculture. So the question's a good question, but I also do think that while agriculture is part of the problem on climate, it's also a very big part of the solution as well.
Absolutely. Our last question comes from Dan. Dan, feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm USDA retired, so I appreciate your leadership while I was there as secretary. And I ran into you one time in North Carolina, and you told the story of when you were in charge of the atomic football. So I wondered if you could share that with the group here.
Sure. Where did you work at USDA, by the way?
At APHIS, USDA.
Oh, were you?
APHIS.
Were you in North Carolina at APHIS or?
Yes, in Raleigh, at the NC State node down there.
Yeah, no, I've been to NC State many times, and one of the great land grants. So here's what happened. During every State of the Union, there's always one member of the cabinet who's kind of the odd person out in the event that there's a national catastrophe. So that person is called a designated survivor. And often it's the Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce. I call it, they always pick the most important secretaries to be the odd person out, not the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. But so anyway, so I was picked. It's 1997 January, and they said, okay, Glickman, you got to leave and go somewhere else in case there's a nuclear attack. At least you'll be the president. And so I didn't think much of it. So they flew me up to New York, where my daughter lives, and I had I had Secret Service, and I had what I assumed was the military escort with the nuclear football. I didn't have much information about what to do with it if something were to happen. So God forbid, if something had happened, I wasn't quite sure what codes to use. But anyway, they took me up there, and I went to my daughter's apartment, and we watched President Clinton give his remarks, and he was prone to talk endlessly. So the speech was supposed to be 40 minutes. It turned out to be about an hour and 40 minutes. So after it was over, all my security said, okay, Mr. Glickman, the mission is terminated. We're going back. You want to come with us? And I said, no, I think I'll take my daughter out to dinner and I'll come back tomorrow. So I took her to dinner that night at a Japanese restaurant, it turned out. And we walked out about midnight in January of 1997 into just a terrible sleet storm. And there wasn't such thing as Uber or Lyft, and there were no cabs that night. And we walked 13 blocks back to her apartment in this sleet storm. I can still feel the biting sleet on my face. And I told my daughter, I said, 3.5 hours ago, I was potentially the most powerful man on the face of the earth, and we can't even get a cab. And so it's a great lesson. The faster you go up, the faster you fall. And I told that story because it's a great lesson in life. You never are on top forever. And hopefully when you're on the bottom, you find a way up. Now today, this is pre 9/11. So today, the designated survivor is given a lot more security. And there's also a designated survivor for members of Congress too, and it's a much more rigorous atmosphere. But it was a great, interesting experience in life, certainly, being the designated survivor. And you may recall there was an ABC television show with Kiefer Sutherland where it ran for a couple of years, and he was the designated survivor because they were going to fire him the next day. They couldn't figure out who else could do it. He was the Secretary of Housing, and they were going to fire him the next day. And then the whole Capitol blew up and he became the president. But that didn't happen to me. So it was, that is as close as I'll get to being president of the United States.
Thank you.
Well, we're so sad that we're out of time, but have so appreciated you and Dan when sharing about your service, your humility, and humor above all. And we want to also thank our audience for tuning in today. And I hope that this has given you an opportunity to gain some new friends in our virtual room, in addition to gaining some insight from Dan. If you haven't had a chance to get a copy of Dan's new book, again, the book can be purchased through the link in the chat box on the right side of your screen. Shortly after we conclude, a recording of this conversation will also be available for playback on the Council's social channels and website. For more than a decade, the Chicago Council has advocated for U.S. leadership in global food and nutrition security and has convened experts and leaders such as Dan to ensure the incredible community of optimists and pragmatists that work on the wicked problems of extreme poverty and malnutrition do not lose momentum or support. Please join us at the Center on Global Food and Agriculture, where we will build on that outstanding work to advance a more sustainable and resilient global food system by addressing challenges facing our planet and the most vulnerable producers and consumers. On behalf of Dan and the Chicago Council, thank you again. See you next time.
Bye.